Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks very much to those of you who've been following along. We have the last webinar of this season today. So very lucky to have Suzanne Bayley with us to send us off. My name is Haley Ross. For those of you who don't know me, I work with CMI, which is the Columbia Mountains Institute of Applied Ecology. And I'm joined here by Marcy Marr, who's with KCP, or the Kootenai Conservation Program. And this year we are presenting the 10th season of CMI's CRED Talks, the Columbia Region Ecological Discussions, and KCP's 12th winter webinar series. I'm going to run us through a bunch of introductions, but before I do that, I just want to pause and I want us all to acknowledge that the areas in which both KCP and CMI work are in the unceded territory of the Sinixt, the Shuswap, the Ktunaxa, and the Syilx Okanagan peoples, who have stewarded and cared for this land, water, and wildlife since time immemorial. And the other thing I want to do is I want to give you the opportunity to provide your own land acknowledgement and just introduce yourself briefly, if you could. So to do that, I would recommend opening up your chat. You'll find that on the toolbar at the very bottom of your screen. And feel free to introduce yourself there and provide an acknowledgement. While you do that, I'm going to just introduce our webinar series. So we've been exploring the theme of lessons for the next chapter of restoration and stewardship. We've welcomed 5 speakers who will discuss this theme from different perspectives, reflecting on key lessons from their careers in ecological restoration, land stewardship, ecosystem monitoring, and we're emphasizing important insights that can and should inform future restoration efforts. This year's series is financially supported by Okanagan Nation Alliance, by Tech, Ecosystem Environmental Consultants, LGL Limited, and KCP's core funders. So a very big thanks to those organizations without whom we wouldn't be able to host this series. And today, as I mentioned, we are going to be welcoming Dr. Suzanne Bayley, and she will be presenting on her work with the Columbia Wetlands Stewardship Partners, assessing the hydrogeomorphic characteristics that lead to healthy wetlands, and how we can use constructed beaver dams to mitigate the efforts of a warming climate on wetlands and streams. Okay, thanks for all those introductions that are rolling in. As they continue to come, I'm going to take the opportunity to tell you briefly about CMI, who we are and what we do. So CMI is a nonprofit organization, and we serve in a sense as an association for people working in the various fields of applied ecology. We provide professional development opportunities that come in the form of conferences, courses, workshops, webinars, of course, and we address everything from field and data science research techniques to more complex land management conundrums. Our website is a great place to learn more about what we do, and what I want to highlight there is that there are fantastic resources, including proceeding documents from all our major events and talk recordings from keynote speakers, and of course, these webinars. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Marcy Marr with KCP.
Great. Thanks, Haley. So again, my name is Marcy Marr, and I'm joining you on behalf of the Kootenai Conservation Program. KCP is a diverse network of more than 85 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, federal, provincial, and local governments, First Nations, land trusts, agricultural producers, and educational institutions who contribute to conserving our region. And the purpose of KCP's partnership is to cooperatively conserve biological diversity and naturally functioning ecosystems of the Kootenays through land conservation and stewardship, and to generate the support and resources needed to advance this effort, including building technical knowledge and expertise through webinars like this. And we're excited to be hosting this webinar series again with CMI, and we'd like to give an additional thanks to our program sponsors, without whom we'd not be able to support this type of work. So now just a few housekeeping details, and then we'll get started. So this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted within a week to both CMI's event webpage and KCP's Winter Webinar Series webpage. We will have a Q&A at the end of Suzanne's presentation, so please use the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar to add a question to the queue. So again, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. And you'll also notice there's an upvote or a thumbs up button in the Q&A. And so if there's a question that you'd like to see answered, please use this feature. Okay, thanks, and back to you, Haley.
Thanks, Marcy. Okay, so now the moment you're all here for, I'd like to introduce Dr. Suzanne Bayley. She is the president of the Columbia Wetlands Stewardship Partners, an NGO in the Columbia Valley of BC. She's an Emeritus Professor of Ecology at the University of Alberta. Suzanne is an expert in ecology and management of wetlands and shallow lakes. Her primary interest is in applied ecology, the effects of climate change on aquatic systems, and she now works to understand the effects of beavers in aquatic systems. So Suzanne, we are going to pass it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Now let me see if I can actually share. Okay. All right. I hope people can see this.
It's
Okay.
coming.
Okay, good. All right, well, thank you, Haley. I'm now trying to see my own screen. Thank you. Okay, so I'm Suzanne Bayley, and I am currently the president of the Columbia Wetlands Stewardship Partners, which is an NGO one of whose goals is to protect the wetlands of Columbia River and Columbia Valley. And I'm joined also by my colleagues, Catriona Leven, Jessica Holden, and Dr. Ryan MacDonald. So the work that I'm reporting on today is really all of our work. And we certainly could not do the work that CWSP could not do the work we do without all the collaborators that we actually have. And so I want to give see if I can advance this, here we go. So my background has been such that many decades I've been studying aquatic systems from estuaries to rivers to lakes to ponds. And among them all is, one of the things that I'd never really considered until about 25 years ago was the role of beaver. And so working in Alberta, in Elk Island National Park, my colleague, Glennis Hood, and I, at the time, she was my graduate student, we were wondering what role were beaver having in Elk Island National Park? Because in 1950, there were no beaver. And in 2000, when we were looking at it, it was the driest year on record. And so Glennis, as part of her PhD thesis, actually measured the area of open water coverage. So you can see here in 1950, everything in yellow is where there was open water. There was more precipitation, but no beaver, and way less open water. And in the year 2000, after a severe drought, beaver were well established, and we had 61% more open water on the land, even though we had a really severe drought. And so that was kind of remarkable to us. And what we found is that if you look on the bottom, the number of active beaver lodges versus the area of open water. So beaver lodges and beaver on the landscape were creating open water, and they were actually mitigating climate change because of these severe droughts that we've been having. So that sort of got me interested here in looking at the role of beaver, but it wasn't until that I came down to Columbia Valley that I started to think in more detail. Just to go into a little bit into background, I think everyone here now in southern BC is aware of the fact that our climate is warming. So there's a new study report out on disaster and climate risk and resilience assessment that just came out and has a lot of really good new information. But basically it shows that the climate is warming in BC, and the warming is accelerating, which is that little hatched blue line. And what they also show is that our temperature have been increasing, and they've been increasing in Columbia Valley as well. And as well, the projections for the temperature depend upon how much future carbon emissions that we have. And they've also modeled what that's going to be. So we know we have been warming. We know that the projections are that it's going to be warming more. And we also know that the snowfall is going down, especially the winter snowfall upon which we all depend so much for our water resources. So this is kind of serious. What's going to happen? And in terms of what's been happening in Western North America and in Columbia Valley and in the Columbia River, which is what we actually look at, we've been seeing declining snowpack. We've seen less snow at lower elevations. We've seen more precipitation coming as rain, lower spring flows, low summer flows, decreased summer moisture, and some extreme events, which of course the Columbia wetlands can handle very well. But permanent streams are turning into semi-permanent streams. So we've been seeing a lot of things for the last 20 years. And the future looks even more extreme. So when I arrived in Columbia Valley in 2013, I was interested to know, well, what's actually happening? What's happening with the Columbia River? What's the hydrology and the ecology doing? And so we started work on the Columbia Valley and the Columbia Wetlands, which are in southeast BC, for those of you who don't already know that, as shown on the right. And then they extend from basically Canal Flats to Donald, which is 180 kilometers. And that's that little blue line in the figure here. And the green is sort of the western benchlands, which we actually started studying sometime later, which we'll also talk about today. So this is where we came. We thought, what impact is the hydrology having on the Columbia wetlands and other wetlands, and what is also the role of beaver dams? And as our first part of our initiative, we were working with the University of Lethbridge, Dr. Chris Hopkinson, who started using remote sensing, looked at the effect of climate change on 188 square kilometers of the Columbia wetlands. In other words, almost all of the Columbia wetlands. And he was using various Landsat and other remote sensing tools to look at the land cover in Columbia wetlands and see if it's changed. And what he found out is that in the areas that he studied intensely, what's shown here is just a relatively small area, but everything in red had been losing open water if you compared from 1984 to 2000 period, from the more recent period of 2004 to 2019. So already on a large scale, it looks like we have been losing open water habitat in the summer. And also at the same time, we've been getting increasing land cover of woody shrubs over that time period as well. So then Chris, with his new graduate student, Italo Rodriguez, said, well, what's going to happen using the climate projections, various types of climate projections? And this next slide, unfortunately, is not very clear, but Dr. Rodriguez found that the areas of open water, the areas of marsh, the areas of wet meadow all decreased in the future under the climate scenarios, and the woody shrubs increased. So this is sort of a large-scale look at the ecology of Columbia wetlands. But none of that, of course, addresses what role do beaver play in these Columbia wetlands. So we started then some of our work funded by various funders, which we'll go over, and said, well, how does the Columbia River and these wetlands actually work? What drives the Columbia wetlands? And basically, three main things drive the Columbia wetlands. The flood pulse, that is the water coming in after snowmelt in the Columbia River, the sediment that is in there, and the beaver dams. And so just as an example of the flood pulse, this is the typical flood pulse that comes in May. It goes very high and sometime in June and early July, and then declines. And so that's how the Columbia River behaves. So what role does that then have on the Columbia, whole Columbia River? What we found in the Columbia River itself is the peak water levels are declining, the volumes are declining, the duration of that flood pulse is getting shorter, the summer water levels are getting lower, and that timing of the peak flow is getting earlier. So what does this actually mean, and can beaver dams help? So just to show what the wetlands actually look like, the wetlands are there because of the fact that they've created natural levees, as you can see by that row of willow right along the edge there. And without those natural levees, we wouldn't actually have wetlands. But when these wetlands, sorry, these levees are formed when the sediment that's in the water gets deposited on the levee and on the vegetation during high water. So the whole wetlands are dependent upon having high water come at certain times. And also, beaver dams play a major role in Columbia wetlands by blocking up some of the channels into the wetlands. And so I'll show this here. So our first question was, what kind of floodplain wetlands do we have in Columbia wetlands, and how are they affected by drought and beaver? I'm not sure whether you can see to the right-hand side of the screen, but this water is going straight over all the levees and filling this entire wetland basin here. And when the water drains back out again, it goes out through these channels, which you can see here. So these are fairly significant channels, or what we call gaps, that are in the levees. And we have something that looks like this here in the center. So you can see that gap with the water coming in. Actually, I might be able to show you where the water comes in right here and spreads out. And then it stays there for a while and then goes back out again. And so leaves the wetlands. And so what we have done is sort of try to understand how they work exactly hydrologically and how the different wetlands differ from each other. So when the river is very low, it's way below all of the wetlands, and that water has to rise up to go through these gaps in the wetland and then flow back out again in these gaps. And so the water rises in one type of wetland, goes in, fills the wetland, flows out. Another type of wetland is where the water rises, has to go over a beaver dam, still goes in, and then flows back out, but is impeded from flowing out by the beaver dam. And the last scenario is the water at low water has to rise all the way up and go upwards to, rise up 2 to 3 meters really, and go over the levees, and then it is prevented from flowing back out. So those seems to be the 3 different types of wetlands that we have in Columbia wetlands. So here you can see as a picture that on the wetland on the left is least connected to the Columbia River. So the water comes in and it's much harder for it to get back out again. In the center there, it's partially connected, flows in, and then it's partially prohibited from flowing back out. And then on the right, the water flows in, and then when the water level in the river drops, it flows back out again. So those are the 3 general types of wetlands that we have here. And just to show you a picture of it, here is the most connected wetland to the Columbia River, which you can see by that bridge on the left-hand slide. That's what it looks like in the spring. So it's basically dry, or it'll be filled with sedges, for example. And on the summertime, it can have upwards of 2 meters or more of water entering. But that water then flows back out. The partially connected wetlands in spring, before the snow melt, there's already some water in there because it didn't flow out. But then on the right, you can see when the water comes, the flood pulse comes, it flows in and over that levee and through the gaps, and then stays there for much of the summer. And in the least connected wetland, the same spring is on the left. So there's quite a bit of water there in the Columbia, in that particular type of wetland that stays there all winter and all spring. And on the right, you can see more water comes in and it tends to stay. So I have a quick question, Haley. Can they see the whole screen, or are we on the right?
They are going to be able to see your slide, and then they'll probably see me right now who's speaking, or just you. They're not going to see the full ribbon of us.
Okay. Well, this is an example of a natural wetland where beavers came in, and you can see the flood pulse early, and then in the red and yellow lines show what happens in the spring and in October and later in the fall season, and then again early in the spring. The water drops out of this wetland. Beaver dams came in there naturally, and they raised the water level about, I think, half a meter or so, and that kept the water high during the fall and winter and the following spring. So that was 0.25 meters of water. So 27,000 cubic meters were in that wetland and stayed in that wetland due to beaver dams. This is not even a very large wetland. So what we found then is that beaver dams retain water in the wetland, and that the most connected wetlands don't have any beaver dams. The partially connected wetlands have 56% of them do have beaver, and in the least connected, 88% of them have beaver dams. So as you can see it, everything in green are those which have beaver dams. So what we wanted to know then, how important is that for the entire Columbia wetlands in terms of our, I forgot to mention, we have 38 studied wetlands, and out of all those 38 study wetlands, 60% of the variation in the hydrology of these wetlands are determined by the levee gaps and the beaver dams that are in them. So that was quite a surprising finding to realize how important beaver dams are for the hydrology of these wetlands. So here's just some pictures of beaver dams in one of our least connected wetlands, and in the center, one of our partially connected wetlands. And we have hundreds of beaver dams across the Columbia wetlands. And as you can see here, by some natural beaver dams and natural levees. Sorry. So why do we care about beaver dams? Well, they retain water on the landscape, they recharge the wetland, they recharge the groundwater, increase the habitat diversity, increase biodiversity of the species there, and reduce flood and fire risk. So they're critically important. And so we were also looked at then some of the wildlife that was using these wetlands. And what we found is that different birds use different wetlands because they require different depths of the water. And so Catriona Leven, one of our co-authors of this seminar here, looked at the spring migratory water birds and looked at the species richness and found more higher species richness in the partially connected and least connected wetlands. So these dammed up wetlands are very critically important to species richness. And she found 22 species that are found only in these partially or least connected wetlands. So it turns out then we have high biodiversity when we have high habitat diversity, and beaver dams and these and levees give us that high diversity of habitat. So on the right we have elk, which use the wetlands that are most connected with the Columbia River, and on the left, as an example, we have the western painted turtle, which use the least connected wetlands. So we need all of these types of hydrological factors affecting the wetlands. But our study at wetlands only made up about 2,000 hectares of the about 20,000 hectares of Columbia wetlands. It turns out that about 74% of the entire Columbia wetlands is actually composed of wetlands that are most connected to the Columbia River. That means they drain out again after they flood. In contrast, the partially and least connected wetlands are only about 26% of the Columbia wetlands. And yet those are the wetlands that have all of these other species that might, like spring and fall migrating waterfowl, and many of the other species that require water all year. So sort of the key takeaway that I would have from this is, yeah, the Columbia wetlands are really threatened by climate change. They're experiencing it now and will experience it in the future. The beaver dams and the levee gaps explain about 60% of the variation in our study wetlands. So building beaver dam analogs would be a very good thing to do in the Columbia wetlands to help maintain water on the landscape. But thus far, we have not been able to receive a permit to do that because of the various requirements of the Water Sustainability Act. And because we are unable to do that, we decided that we would look at other wetlands in Columbia Valley. And here's where we looked at the effect of climate change on some of the small benchland wetlands on the western side of Columbia Valley. And we had no idea how many wetlands there are, what was happening to them. Were they affected by drought, or whether they had beaver? We had really no idea. And so what we did is we looked at the BC Freshwater Atlas, Lakes and Wetlands. That's a publicly available database for the province. And we looked at about 45% of the 828 lakes and wetlands between Spilamachine and Canal Flats. And we assessed 45% of them either using a drone or in person. And what we were interested in is, what is their status? How healthy are they? And what we found is, first off, that most of them are very small. They're less than 3 hectares, whether it's the wetlands or the lakes, they're quite small. And so that was interesting, because then, do they have beaver dams? What's the situation? And so first thing we did on 443, I think, of the wetlands, we looked at what were their water sources. And Dr. Ryan MacDonald tried to understand on these 443 wetlands, where was their source of water? And some, turns out, were very isolated. The majority, actually, were isolated, didn't have any apparent surface or groundwater source that was highly detectable. Some had an intermittent source. Some had sort of what we call a minor. Some were associated with a lake, and some are associated with more major rivers. So we then said, how healthy are these wetlands? And because of the drone work that we had been doing, we were able to look at about 214 that we had good drone images for, and we could say, are these wetlands drying? And it turns out we assessed whether they were drying based on whether they had hydrophobic or hydrophytic, that is, vegetation that likes water or the vegetation that prefers dry land. And we looked at that and could rate them. And we found that basically 79% of these wetlands showed evidence of lack of water when we were doing this. So that was kind of surprising. But we thought, well, then where are these wetlands located? And so we looked and said, does where they're located in the landscape make a difference in terms of whether they might be drying or not? And so in that case, we found that some wetlands are associated with lakes, some are associated with rivers or streams, and some seem to isolated from any surface water source. And we then again looked at the vegetation associated with them. We also then, looking at the over 400 wetlands, we put them on a map and then evaluated them in terms of their water source. And it turns out that our entire region, our study region, in this case, from Spilamachine to Canal Flats, is dry. But the further south you go, the drier it is. And this also, of course, has implications for the people who are in Cranbrook or down near the US-Canadian border or in Okanagan. Is many of our areas are dry. And I think it's very useful to have an understanding of how dry and what those implications are. So that's actually what we looked at. So we then examined in person many of these lakes. For example, west of Columbia Lake, a wetland is drying. Another tiny wetland is drying here. Even a larger Sun Lake is dry. So, clearly we're experiencing a lot of drying. And this brings us up to the idea of, looking at a water balance of these lakes and wetlands. And this is a very simplified idea of a water balance, but it's driven by, you have precipitation on the wetland, you have evapotranspiration from the wetland or lake, you have various sources of inflow water and groundwater, and you have outflow of outflow of creeks and from the groundwater as well. So what we basically found for our area, and it might be true of many other areas in southern BC, is that the lakes and wetlands will dry up without a surface or groundwater source. So if you have only precipitation and evapotranspiration, our area is too dry to have wetlands continue. So that's really essentially called a moisture deficit. And what we have found is evapotranspiration exceeds the precipitation by about 20 to 40 centimeters each year now. And precipitation upwards of 50 centimeters, evapotranspiration upwards of 90 in some cases. So that deficit is shown in orange there on the right. And what we find when we looked at sort of west of Columbia Lake, we're already at a 45 centimeter deficit in west of Columbia Lake, almost a half a meter deficit in terms of water availability. And up in the Briscoe Spillimachine area, a little further north, we have a 21 centimeter deficit now. So then Ryan MacDonald looked at applied some of the climate models to this and tried to have a better understanding what would happen to this moisture deficit by region. And what he found is that even though we're going to be getting much warmer, the deficit doesn't increase by that much, and nor in either location, either west of Columbia Lake or up by Briscoe Spillimachine. And the reason for that is likely because the models project that we'll have more rainfall. And I don't know whether that is going to be valid. And I think that's one of the areas that climate modelers are actually working on. We haven't seen much evidence of increased rainfall yet, but the models do predict additional rainfall. But we have a severe moisture deficit right now. So that means really to restore wetlands in our region and many other of these drying areas of southern BC, we really must have either surface water or a very large, secure groundwater source to restore wetlands. So we wanted to know then, can we develop some kind of an index or some kind of an approach that would enable us to determine whether our restorations were going to be successful? And then Ryan MacDonald here decided that he could do that. And he used our 443 wetlands and made what we call a restoration feasibility index, and found that could rate them according to low, moderate, high, or very high success of restoration success. But this is all, of course, a desktop approach, which I think is very useful. He used to make this restoration feasibility index. He used publicly available data that it had a wetness index, a precipitation minus evapotranspiration, an inflow source. He used all of these and put them together. And what it indicates is many of our wetlands in this particular region are going to be very, very hard to restore. So this summer we went out and field tested about 50 more wetlands to try to validate this model, and he's now revised this some. And in his revision, I heard yesterday that even fewer wetlands actually have the potential to be successfully restored based on this desktop approach. So what he did then was to look at all of the wetlands from Spillimachine down to Canal Flats, and then rank them in terms of their successful restoration potential. But that was all a desktop approach. And when you actually get out into the field, there are many things that you also might consider, like how fast, when does the water come, how much of it does arrive, how much humans have altered the landscape. And beaver dams can actually modify water sources to create wetlands in naturally dry areas. And this is a site that we have west of Columbia Lake again. So I think that sort of desktop approach is very useful, but we do appreciate that field assessments are also critically important. So our key message here is beaver dams can mitigate climate change by retaining water, even in very, very dry places. One other thing that we were surprised at is that they also provide riparian habitat for wildlife corridors, and these link up very beautifully with the work that Kootenai Connect is doing to show where wildlife corridors are as well. But we also realized that we need to show that we can actually build beaver dams to mitigate some of this drought that we have been experiencing. And like others in Columbia Valley and in southern BC, we've started to build beaver dam analogs. And Delaney Hall last week gave a really good overview of some of the work they're doing in the Okanagan as well. And this mimics the natural beaver dams. It's low tech, made with natural materials. One of the things that we also feel is that you don't really have to have beaver return to the site to get ecosystem benefits. These beaver dam analogs are going in areas where beavers have abandoned, many cases for 100 years, have abandoned many of these creeks. And the beaver dam analogs can make very good wildlife habitat and save water on the ground. We use two approaches by either repairing old beaver dams or creating new ones. So as part of our work in these western benchlands, we actually have created two beaver dam analogs in 2024 and 21 in 2025, and we're proposing to create 35 of them in next year. So we are creating ones that are successful, but not all of them, and I'll show you why. So our approach, of course, was to use what the province recommends, which is to use what they call a riverscape restoration approach. So we have these many, many small wetlands along a creek. And what we found is when we went back to those, some of them had great potential for success for a BDA, and others were probably less feasible for a variety of reasons. But we did use this approach and our restoration feasibility approach as well. But what we found is that, as you can see in orange here, the logging and the cut blocks occur throughout the region, and it's contributed to the loss of water and to the loss of beaver, but we don't know how much. We have a lot of degraded and abandoned beaver dams along these creeks, but we don't know why they were abandoned, whether it was logging or why. And of course, we can't determine what caused what at this time. Excuse me. So we've done then a lot of beaver dam analog planning, where we survey the existing beaver dams, we survey the defunct dams, we estimate the inundation area and map all that area. We survey locations for new dams, we do soil surveys, water surveys, we do a lot of planning. And what we found is that we in 2024 in green, this is the water level in one of our pre-beaver dam analog sites. And we had a big drought in 2025. And when we installed the beaver dam, we had a 25 centimeter increase in water levels, as shown by that red arrow. But what we also saw was 2025, both 2024 and 2025 were very dry years. And you can see that in our reference wetland as the water declines later in the season. Here's another site that we did where 2024, before we built our BDA, the water chugs along at a fairly low level. And at the end of that year, we put in a BDA. So 2025, you can see that the water level rose almost 45 centimeters. But as you gets towards September and August, it goes down a very low level. And that's because the river ran dry. So really, beaver dams can mitigate drought, but not always. We still have to have water. So for the province and for ourselves, we continue to do a lot of both vegetation surveys, wildlife surveys, breeding bird surveys, soil surveys, and we do a lot of pre and post restoration permit surveys that are required for the permitting. We have to assess the structures and then the water and water quality and the status of the dam. So all of these dams and sites require a lot of in the field work. So just as an example, here's one of our sites. It's beaver dam analog was in 2023 and post was in 2025. And you can see a very significant increase at pale blue, which is the water stored on the landscape, despite this extreme drought that we've had. So I guess in summary, I do want to say all wetlands that we're having, whether it's Columbia wetlands or the benchland wetlands, they're vulnerable to climate change. But beavers do provide a valuable service in maintaining these wetlands. And in the Columbia wetlands, we really wouldn't have nearly as many very extremely valuable waterfowl areas in the spring without having beaver on the landscape. And the wetlands on the benches are very small, but they're critically important. But we can mitigate a lot of the loss of habitat using these beaver dam analogs. And we think that it's essential, though, that we have to know that there's a surface water source, and we can't put beaver dam analogs in anymore or build wetlands unless we know that there's an adequate surface water source. So we're working with our wetland restoration feasibility index and upgrading it to guide our wetland restoration efforts. And we hope that this might be useful for people in other regions. And I do want to emphasize that this is all very collaborative work that we do here. But overall, we have major challenges like many people do. And beaver dam analogs may not keep on providing enough water, even with the best planning. Because of that, the long-term sustainability, for 20, 30 years in the future is really uncertain. But one thing that would help a lot is if the province would protect beaver. They allow the killing and trapping of beaver, and I feel that this is really unwise given what impacts of climate change that we're going to see. And the other thing we have is I think that the requirements that the government has under the Water Sustainability Act are pretty extreme for these conservation projects. They don't seem to have any special consideration for conservation projects that mitigate climate change, that have relatively small risk associated with them. There's no triage associated with how they assess permits for the Water Sustainability Act. And I think that that is a real challenge. And then also, I don't think that the provincial policy is progressive enough to address these accelerating impact of what is really a climate crisis. So in conclusion, we don't know much at all about this ecosystem engineer that are beaver, their populations, their ecology. We know more about grizzly bears by far than we know about an ecosystem engineer that changes our entire watersheds. I think we need to do way more to protect beavers, because killing and trapping of beavers is, in my view, the same as destroying wetlands. And if the province requires people who are building BDAs to remove them at the end of their permit period, that's the same thing as destroying wetlands. And that's a policy decision they'll have to make. But we don't need the BDAs to have beaver return to provide the ecosystem services that they're doing. And I think drought will definitely continue, but building these BDAs and protecting wetlands is the way to mitigate climate warming in our entire landscapes. And I'd like to thank all of our funders, especially Climate Change and Environment and Climate Change Canada and Columbia Basin Trust and all of our other sponsors. There's no question that we couldn't do any of this work that we've been doing without them. And thank you very much. And questions?
That was great, Suzanne. Thank you so much. It was fabulous. And I bet there's many people out there that are super glad that we have recorded your talk, because it was so information rich. I think folks are going to go back and review some of your information. And it's such a great example of how you and your team have, gotten to know the wetlands system, both in the floodplain and benchlands, and in knowing that, really being able to figure out what restoration should look like. So That's really, really great. Thanks so much for putting all of that work into your talk. So we have a few questions here I'm just going to run through. And so let's see. Thank you for everybody doing upvotes. That sort of helps me. Here we go, Suzanne. Here's one that many people are interested in. How do you determine water source, including groundwater sources for the benchland wetlands?
We actually have, we actually don't really consider a groundwater source because the groundwater is very important in a few sites, like many of our recreation sites actually are lakes that are groundwater fed. But most of the other sites really have an unknown amount of groundwater. I did some stable isotope work in the Columbia Wetlands also and found that even groundwater is important there. But some of that work also showed that that groundwater is supplied on an annual basis. So I guess I'd say that we don't really think that groundwater sources and our lack of knowledge about them is so great that we would not think, we don't think that people should rely on groundwater source to build BDAs. I think that would be my overall answer. I mean, I've looked at stable isotopes, I've looked at other stuff, and you know, I think groundwater, the knowledge about groundwater is so uncertain in most areas that, and we need a lot more work on it. But I think we're risking a lot to try to depend on groundwater. We don't anymore. Initially, we did, and that was one of our errors.
Yeah, okay. Next question is, do you know what's happening with beaver populations in the Columbia Valley area?
No. What we do know is that there are a lot of beavers in Columbia wetlands that have been there presumably since they returned after the extirpation, and they have increased, and they're probably at some maybe steady state, rising and falling. They move around quite a bit in Columbia wetlands, um, and so I think that's very good. But in the benchlands, some of our sites lost beaver upwards of 100 years ago. Some have lost them more recently. We know that because of doing tree ring analysis on the degraded dams. And we have no idea what those populations are. And we have no idea what the populations are in Columbia wetlands either. So that's why I mentioned that as one of the things that I think needs a lot more work.
Yeah, okay. And related to that, are there any plans to relocate beavers into either the sites you've restored with your BDAs or to help them repopulate in the uplands?
I think that projects that would do that would be very good. And I've heard about some that have been, uh, people have applied for funding, but it's almost like it's two separate things. You can build the BDA, but then if you want to actually use beaver, what we would call nuisance beavers and put them in, and I know one was put in one of the sites in Columbia Valley some years ago and it died because there was not enough water. I think that would require a major effort to have a better understanding of how good the water flows are. Is it deep enough? There is a so-called BRAT model that has been used extensively in the US, and we have it, Ducks Unlimited did it here in Canada, sorry, in BC. And that BRAT model shows water, is the water adequate, water levels adequate, and is there adequate food? That's the primary things that they actually look at. But that hasn't been validated in very many places. So um, I think that people could restore beaver, but the whole point is we can still retain water without having beaver. Adding beaver would be nice, but not essential.
Okay. So we're going to shift a gear now and talk more about the Water Sustainability Act, okay? You mentioned a couple times some of your challenges and so many people would like you to dig deeper into that. So if you could explain more about the Water Sustainability Act and its restriction on beaver dam analogs, that would be great.
Well, I think the positive thing is that they are permitting them. So that's good. I think that they were kind of astonished by, the rapid increase of applications that were using beaver dam analogs, and so they didn't have a very coherent understanding of them at the time, and I think they're getting better. Um, but the main problem with the Sustainability Act is, in my personal view, is that it requires anything that's associated with wetlands or creeks to meet the regulations that have been set. And most of those regulations are based on what the risk might be. And most of that risk has associated with flooding. They don't really seem to try to address the risk that we have for drought. But so they require us to get a Section 11 permit for these beaver dam analogs, and we have to have less than 10,000 cubic meters of water stored. Well, that's like almost nothing, you know. And if we want to have more than 10,000 cubic meters, we have to get a water license. Only governments can get water license. We tried to get a water license, and even Environment Canada, working with Nature Trust of BC, tried to get a water license in one of our wetlands. That was rejected because one of the challenges that we have on floodplain wetlands is we might get 100,000 cubic meters of water coming in and 75,000 going out, but we're storing 25,000. Well, that exceeds the requirements for a Section 11, so we are not permitted to do so. Even so, then we decided to apply through the Shuswap band, who very kindly said, "Oh yes, we are willing to be the government for you." Well, they rejected that because the Shuswap band did not count as a government for one of our sites. So we just decided until the Water Sustainability Act looks at both drought and flood and develops what I would hope would be a triage system. These whole suite of BDAs or projects that might address drought and flood are really low risk, and we have fewer requirements for them. I think it's going to be a challenge for any of us to actually build BDAs.
Yeah.
I hope they do. And keep in mind, this isn't the people that we're applying, the permit people that we apply to in, on the ground, in front country and front counter BC. This is the people higher up that develop the regulations that they are now enforcing.
Yeah.
It's a whole system. I mean, they have been tried to be so helpful, and yet they're constrained. And so that means we're hugely constrained. Excuse me.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Thanks for describing this regulatory environment that you've been up against. And again, glad that you can get some BDAs up in the benchlands. All right. So let's see. So in areas that have lost beaver populations, are there active trap lines? Do you know?
Yes.
And if so, how, has addressing them, these trap lines, been a part of your strategy, or how do you see, interfacing with the trapping interests and in terms of provincial governments permitting?
That's not something that we've followed through. Keep in mind, most of the groups that do BDAs are relatively small groups. We don't have the capacity to do governance, to do policy to the way that we would like. I would actually hope that the First Nations would come in and say, do we really need to be trapping beaver in a lot of these areas? I don't know if they were trapped out or, they just didn't have adequate food. But they still do they have trap lines everywhere. But whether they're beaver trap lines, partially that depends on the price of beaver pelts. And I do know they're still trapping them out of Columbia Wetlands, though.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah, I just don't think that we should be trapping beaver given the droughts that we're going to be facing. But we haven't tried to work with the province. I think that's a new area that collaborative work with the First Nations and NGOs would be a very positive place to go to find out how important it is, for starters.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
here's some more related questions around that. So BDAs are built to help retain water storage, but they're not intended to be large. And most BDAs are built up to be 3 to 4 feet tall. So like beaver dams, they slow and spread water. And in high flow events, if the woody debris that flows down actually, has a certain kind of effect. So in terms of the blowout, maybe just explain what you think the concern is in terms of a regulatory environment?
I think that the regulatory environment is very concerned about uh, destroying infrastructure and below dams. There have been very, very, very few instances that have been occurred from sequential blowout of beaver dams, but a few have occurred. For example, CPR I know goes and removes beaver dams that are close to their tracks because they do it in Columbia wetlands. It doesn't affect any of the sites because their beavers also build multiple sequential dams on the outflow of most of our channels. But I just don't. Can you repeat the question? I forgot.
Yeah, it was more just explaining, you talked about the 10,000
Oh yeah,
square meters and
right,
just that overall, sense of a BDA versus infrastructure and just sort of what the
right.
concerns are in that regulatory you know,
Yeah,
mindset and knowing that, these are stick structures 3 to 4 feet tall and
yeah.
yeah, just more of your
And
thoughts on that.
yeah. Well, because the province was concerned, they wanted us to use this riverscape approach, whereby we would have multiple ones in a river, so that if one blew, the next one would be down below. Part of it depends upon, the creeks where we are so small that they just don't get enough water to blow. But some of the creeks that other groups are putting in are larger, and they're addressing this issue of sequential failure by putting in multiple ones. Um, there have been very, very few instances recorded of dams blowing and affecting infrastructure. So I really can't say that I think that that's a major problem, but the province is risk averse, and that's why they are so strict about this.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, yeah,
So
it's
there's
it's a problem.
yeah. So someone's interested in knowing whether you've got a report or a paper summarizing the variables that you've used in monitoring pre and post BDAs, and then someone added in that they'd be curious about how water temperature has affected things if you've been measuring water temperature.
Well, we use these hobo water level monitors, and it does measure temperature. So we have that data. And of course, the water can get quite warm. It comes up and it's quite cool, but then of course, as it spreads out, it does get a bit warmer in the sunlight. But we have written up many of our results and are actually on our website and on KCP's website under Kootenai Connect. So most of the parameters are available there from 224, 225, and we'll be putting them, well, actually 223, 224, and this year we'll be putting in our 225 results. So all of that data are available under the beaver hydrology projects that Columbia Wetlands Stewardship Partners is written up. Yeah, we have all that data there.
Okay, great. So there's a few questions around forestry and cut blocks. Here's one from someone who's on Vancouver Island and wondering, and where cut blocks get wetter post-harvest, which our work has shown small wetlands get deeper and stay wet longer into the summer and fall. Do you know if that's also the case in the Kootenays?
That is, we don't actually have any data. That's fortunate that they have data. I mean, Vancouver Island and the coast has a completely different hydrologic regime than what we have in Okanagan and in the Kootenays, and even the West Kootenay. We haven't. They have a lot of drying wetlands. I know that as well, but Vancouver Island is very different. We do not know what the effect of log cut blocks are on our hydrologic water budget uh, at all. I've tried to go back and look at some work from Alberta and from other areas of BC, and I haven't I'm not enough of a hydrologist to really know that. That's a good question for Ryan MacDonald.
Okay, great. And last question here, we'll probably take, or maybe there's one more I can fit in, but in terms of, there's a lot of work going on province-wide around beaver dam analogs, and just wondering, are you coordinating information with other areas in the province where BDAs are being constructed? For instance, last year, the Cooks Ferry Band worked with the BC Wildlife Federation to construct BDAs. And as you know, there's been other examples as well throughout the province. But how's that going in terms of coordinating and being collaborative?
Well, I think BCWF has been very supportive of us, and we sort of work together on some of these things. And for example, we went out together last year to look at a whole suite of new potential wetlands that we might do. But so I would say we try to be collaborative, but it's probably more in southeastern BC, doesn't extend up to other areas as much. But we do collaborate with BCWF and Living Lakes Canada and any other groups that we can.
Yeah. Okay, one last question here that's sort of a combo that I see of two that are remaining. But someone's asking whether you can suggest any sort of advocacy campaign for those folks who are non-scientists and ways they could champion, how to help mitigate some of the challenges you mentioned. And maybe related to that is, what do we need to do to be helping protect beavers on the landscape and ensuring that we all do the right thing?
Yeah. Well,
So part A, part B.
well, certainly Living Lakes Canada has become more active to try to address this bigger question of protecting watersheds and protecting the water on watersheds. So I would say probably go to them. They have a groundwater program, for example. CWSP does not have one. We give all of our data to them so that they can store it, which is another big issue is we do all this work, but who keeps a record of a lot of this work? That maybe that BCWF will keep the record of where all the BDAs are that have been constructed. Once we no longer do it, we don't know. I'm not sure. I'd say again through BCWF, they have their wetland division. They also have their, the wildlife division, and they would be a good one to address also, you know, why do we have trapping? There's a BC Trappers Association as well. And I don't honestly know whether the price of pelts is enough that people are trapping them, but they can trap them. And you can't take away somebody's rights without having a discussion about it. And that's just one of the features of our democracy. So I would say BC's Trappers Association and BCWF, their wildlife and their wetland group in Living Lakes.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was a lot of presenting and fielding of questions, and yeah, totally appreciate that. I'll turn it over to you, Haley, and you can close us out.
Great. I'm just going to change our screen share here in a moment. Should be loading now. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you. I also wanted to sneak in a little thank you for Catriona Leven. You can't see her, but she's hiding out in the background with us for lots of support. She's been working with Suzanne Bayley quite a lot. Thank you to our webinar sponsors, without whom we couldn't do this series altogether. Thanks to everybody who participated and followed us along and are continuing to share these resources and recordings with your network. It's so wonderful. I can't tell you how great it is to see those recordings continue to get viewed over time. And the recording views are healthy, and that's because you're sharing them out with your networks. So thanks. The other thing I wanted to say is that as we are on the last webinar of this particular season, we have an evaluation. So post-event evaluation. I know everybody loves those, but I did put the link in the chat. It's probably disappeared. I'm going to add that link again just now. If you would be able to take the time to let us know what you thought about the series, that helps us to improve it in the future. It helps us to give feedback for those of us who did participate. And it helps us, importantly, to figure out where to take it with regards to what sorts of subjects and themes you're interested in continuing to hear about. as we prepare for next year. So I think there was a quick question in the Q&A I was going to address, and that was somebody asking for some resources and references from Suzanne's talk. And I'll just let you know that I can gather those and we can make those available via links on the event webpage. So we'll list those resources for you. But of course, you can reach out to Suzanne for more questions, or myself, Kendall with KCP, and that whole KCP team. We're here to field questions and redirect you as needed. So thanks everyone for your participation. We really appreciate it. I think that's it from us. Yeah.
Great. Bye, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.